This is Jason Unruhe, the Maoist rebel, political commentator, and third worldist communist, reminding you that Strasserism is ID-pol garbage, and that national liberation struggle is intercommunal progression. I now bring you the man that first theorized the revolutionary ideas of intercommunalism, Huey P. Newton, from the original Black Panther Party.
Stay right here.
I'm confident that I will be free, providing that we're successful in the battle that we're engaged in now, and that is to revolutionize the court system. It all depends upon this problem.
What's your treatment been like in jail?
Said to me this morning that the cards appear to be stacked against you. This being so, that perhaps you would have to take the witness stand. Do you have any psychic reserve about taking the witness stand?
None whatsoever. That I'll only tell the truth and express my innocence, which I am innocent. So I have no feeling at all against taking the witness stand, as I demonstrated this morning. Right.
Yes, your question this morning about your money. Do you have any money?
No, I'm in a severe state of poverty.
What about the Huey Newton Defense Fund?
I don't know too much about the Huey Newton Defense Fund, actually.
Who's paying your attorney's fee?
I believe the Huey Newton Defense Fund.
You're obviously in good spirits, Huey. Why?
Because I have the people behind me, and the people are my strength. I think that the court structure and the government is very low in spirit at this time, because they're realizing that, as Che Guevara says, they're giants, but they have feet of clay, because they're divorced from the people of the world. I have this strength, so therefore that I'm very secure, and my spirit is very high, and I know that we'll have a victory.
You cannot win the chess game of legal deterrence without having a mass movement of people behind you. This really should seem very obvious, that you can't make a mass movement without having a mass of people behind you. But there's some people who seem to think it is, not so much saying it, but in practice carrying that out. Dare to struggle, dare to win. What we need is an auto-determinative spirit that encourages the coexistence of all people together. Multiculturalism existed long before identity politics did. But this multiculturalism, in its original essence, not the white supremacist interpretation of the word multiculturalism, but the one originally intended by the bourgeoisie, hasn't worked. We can see racial tensions getting worse. We can see the adamant defenses of what are essentially concentration camps on the southern border of the United States. We can see the growing hatred of minorities inside of Europe. This is a product of the bourgeois conception of multiculturalism having failed. We propose something very different. We propose a cooperation. We have no right to further colonize anyone. Doing so reinforces imperialism. And if you're a Marxist, being anti-imperialist is not just something that you fight for. It is a duty for you to fight against. To not do so is a rejection of everything Lenin stood for. Before watching this video, please watch my first two videos that I made, confronting the evils of colonialism, Anti-Colonialism 2012 and Anti-Colonialism 2020. Now, anti-colonialism is not identity politics, because it's about national liberation. National liberation is not identity politics. This is two different things. Nazism is identity politics, because it relies on the premise of whiteness and defending said whiteness as an identity, not the real Europeanness, like Italian identity or German culture, etc. That's about a broad statement of whiteness. But watch the earlier videos and that'll explain that. Voting for someone simply because they're black, gay, Jewish, or female is identity politics, because you're voting for them based purely on their identity and not the actual policies that they support. National liberation struggle, without a doubt, is revolutionary intercommunalism. That's a very important point to keep in mind. Identity politics is reactionary intercommunalism. Whiteness is a colonial Eurocentricity. It is also self-colonizing to some degree. Anti-white politics fails to remove this Eurocentricity. In other words, it doesn't actually confront the problem. It just complains about it, and in many cases, makes it worse. Going around and yelling at every European saying, "Kill Whitey," reinforces that whiteness. Because not only have you not confronted it, you haven't explained anything about it. You haven't educated anybody on the ideas, and you can't expect them to agree with you if they can't understand what you're saying. So either you're just doing, hating as white people, or you're trying to educate them on what whiteness is so that you can combat it and eliminate it. You got a choice to make there. What's it going to be? Do you want to be some college campus, liberal screaming, "Kill Whitey"? Or do you want to be revolutionary? Do you want to scientifically tackle the problem and solve it? The choice is yours. The anti-dialectical do not understand that there is no white nation, because the white nation is very different from the black nation. The black nation is an identity of people who have lost their identity as Africans because they don't know where they came from. Whiteness is a construct created to oppose anything that's different. So it's very different. And it's different from, say, having British culture or Russian culture, etc. These are two different things. All Europeans that embrace the Eurocentric construct of whiteness colonize themselves inwardly. Because not only are they rejecting their original selves, they're taking on an artificially constructed one that is just racism. Believing that they are worth nothing without subjugating others to colonial power. Doing this keeps capitalism in charge. White pride does not work. White guilt does not work. The only way to end whiteness is to start a new pan-Europeanism. This respects Africa and Asia as oppressed through racism and colonialism. Blackness is not identity politics, because there actually is a black nation. Black people are the descendants of African slaves. They manifest a new nation, a black nation. The most revolutionary of them seek to build a new Africa. Solidarity to indigenous struggles all across the world. But specifically, I want to refer to the ongoing pipeline situation in Canada. believe it or not, this is actually one of the simplest things to solve. An alternate route, which didn't violate native sovereignty, was already proposed. All the pipeline company would have had to have done would be to move the pipeline through that alternate proposed route. And none of this would have happened. But that's not how capitalism works. I now leave you with a Telesur interview with Nick Estes that came out on December 12, 2019.
Hello, I'm Leila Segabi and welcome to a new episode of From Caracas. On today's show is joining us Nick Estes. He is an author of Our History is the Future. He is also assistant professor for American Studies at the University of New Mexico, a co-founder of the indigenous resistance group, the Red Nation, and a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So Nick, let me ask you. You begin your book with 2 Thanksgiving stories. Tell us what is the meaning behind them.
So the first Thanksgiving story is the founding of Thanksgiving in the United States, or what would become the United States. And it begins with a massacre of indigenous people, specifically the Pequots. And the Thanksgiving that happened was in celebration of this massacre. And that was several hundred years ago. And I fast forward several hundred years later to the present, or to the near present in Standing Rock, when a group of us were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline in the Bismarck, North Dakota Mall, and we organized a prayer circle that was violently put down by the police and attacked, but it was a nonviolent protest. And it was just contrasting and showing the similarities, but also the differences in how people remember or don't remember indigenous people of the United States.
Okay, so your book's last words are, "We are challenged not just to imagine, but to demand the emancipation of Earth from capital. For the Earth to live, capitalism must die." Explain us your words.
In the current movement to transition away from fossil fuels, and the current movement to get in the United States what we're calling the Green New Deal, which is also the same in Canada, there's a lot of talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels without understanding the economic system that has brought us to this point, and that is capitalism, right? And so I think there's somewhat of a dishonesty or a refusal to acknowledge this. And we can look at indigenous cultures and histories to see the ways in which capitalism has affected us, because capitalism is based on expansion and growth and the commodification of nature. And while European traditions have understood capitalism as the contestation of labor and bosses, indigenous people show that capitalism is also about the commodification of nature, and you run out of nature at some point. And so they've privatized our lands, they privatized nature, and this has led us to this specific precipice that we're facing with catastrophic climate change.
So you're right that the mobilization against the Dakota Access Pipeline marked an historic resistance in resurgent indigenous histories not seen for generations, if ever. Explain to us what the movement at Standing Rock was about and why you assign it such an important role in the long sweep of the indigenous history.
On one hand, Standing Rock was a movement within a moment of time, but on the other hand, it was a moment within a larger movement of history. So if we look at it as a movement within a moment, it's responding specifically to the expansion of oil and gas pipelines throughout North America that are trespassing through indigenous lands and imperiling indigenous water, and it has unified indigenous people in a way that we haven't seen before. And not just indigenous people, but also non-indigenous people and people from different social locations. So we wouldn't have something like the Green New Deal had it not been for Standing Rock. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez began her successful bid for Congress at the Standing Rock camps, right? Wow. And so if we think about that, that's really momentous just for this particular moment in time. But the title of the book suggests an alternative way of viewing history and seeing Standing Rock as an iteration of a long trajectory of indigenous resistance going back centuries.
So since Trump's election and since the last violent removal of the Standing Rock protesters and encampment, what's been going on in Standing Rock? Did the protests serve as like a rebirth of Native activist movements?
So prior to Standing Rock, as I detail in the book, indigenous communities in Lakota and Dakota reservations began organizing against Keystone XL. Obama denied the permit for Keystone XL back in 2015, and as we now know, Trump has fast-tracked the construction of that pipeline. So we were ready, we had already organized in our communities and we were ready to fight the Keystone XL pipeline. And so when Dakota Access came along, that's why it was such a big movement, because we had already galvanized a lot of the popular forces within our communities and outside our communities. And so when Standing Rock ended, when the camps were violently evicted by the police, we just continued doing what we were doing prior to that, and that is building our communities, strengthening our culture and language, but also working on our internal issues facing our communities about where are we going to get our food in 20 years if climate change is going to threaten our food sources? Where are we going to get our water? And so these questions are still being debated and talked about, but there is a movement at Standing Rock to move to an off-the-grid approach to develop wind and solar amongst tribal nations.
So in your book, you consistently take prophecy, tradition, and different epistemologies seriously, but the book is still rooted in a materialist analysis of history and the current moment. Why is it important to bring these analyses together?
So typically, indigenous knowledge is thought of as a parochial knowledge, something that only is useful for a specific region or just a local culture. But as I show in the book, indigenous knowledge, specifically from the Lakota people, is very expansive. Lakota actually means friend or ally. Our basis of humanity is about making relations and establishing good relations with people and the non-human world. That's a very materialist conception of history. We require mutual aid to survive, not just amongst humans for cooperation and goodwill, but also amongst plant and animal nations as well. And so when we think about that in a larger context, we can look at Lakota people as going to the United Nations and using our treaty rights that we signed with the United States government as a spear for all indigenous rights, that it's everybody's obligation to defend our territory and defend our land. And this coincides with other traditions of resistance, not just from indigenous people, but from African Americans, from the Chicano movements, to the Third World liberation movements, to the movements for decolonization globally.
So, Nick, in your book, you focus on 7 historical moments of resistance. You say they form a historical roadmap for collective liberation. How did you choose these histories?
So the number 7 is sacred to us. And so there's a little bit of a background for that. That's why I chose the 7 chapters. But one thing that I was working against when I was writing this history is that indigenous history is always thought of as in the past or in the 19th century. In the 20th century and the 21st century, they're never seen as continued. And the way I was told history as a tribal historian and as somebody who is knowledgeable of our oral histories is that nobody saw a clear delineation between what happened in the 19th century and what happened in the 20th century. It was one continuous history. And so it was my obligation to show this longer trajectory, and that if we look at history in a longer context, we can find solutions to contemporary problems. And in indigenous people, because we have such a long memory of resistance, of living with the land in correct relations, it's important to put that into a longer historical context. Because as a historian, I don't look to the future. As a historian, I move towards the future, facing backwards and looking at what has happened in the past.
So, talking about this, what's the real meaning of the title of your book?
The real meaning of the title of the book is much like how Venezuelans understand their history, with Afro resistance, with indigenous resistance, with anti-colonial resistance. It's in your blood as Venezuelans to resist. It's in our blood as indigenous and Lakota people to resist. And that's who we are. That's the traditions that we draw on. Our future is based in our history and our land. To live dignified lives, we have to have a dignified history that we can hold on to.
So, an important contribution of your book is bringing to the reader's attention the long tradition of indigenous internationalism within the formerly and currently colonized world, particularly, let's say, in Palestine. Can you expand on that history and how it affects current anti-imperial perspectives?
So one thing that I was trying to uncover with this particular history was an unknown history. After the Red Power movement, US media stopped paying attention to what indigenous people were doing. But in the 1970s and the 1980s, we were doing amazing things. We were sending delegations to Iran, to Libya, to South America, to Palestine, and to Lebanon. We were making connections with other nations of the world, because that's our God-given right as indigenous people and as nations, because that's what nations do. And so we had allied ourselves with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, because like us, they were facing statelessness and the colonization of Israel. And so they helped us navigate that human rights framework at the United Nations.
So can you tell us more about what are you doing here in Caracas?
So I'm part of a delegation with the Red Nation, and we are visiting particularly indigenous Venezuelan communities and learning about the struggles for indigenous rights concerning the land and natural resources. But also we're here to just see for our own eyes what is happening on the ground, because in the United States, and especially for indigenous people, we never consider maybe the United States media or maybe the US media is not portraying the accurate story. And so we're here to see for our own eyes what is going on here, and especially what's happening with indigenous people.
So do you believe American indigenous people and Venezuelan indigenous people have the same goal?
Absolutely. One thing that I was very impressed about is learning about the Indigenous University that teaches bilingual courses, teaches in Spanish and also the indigenous language, but then also inviting indigenous elders and knowledge keepers in as thesis advisors, as peers to review scholarship and to produce knowledge alongside universities. We are working towards that in the United States, but it's very difficult with a neoliberal university system.
So let me ask you, Trump's sanctions against Venezuela, how has this affected your people?
So to understand that question, we have to go back to the North American oil boom, which began in 2007 and 2008. This coincided with increased aggression against Venezuela, because Venezuela, as everyone knows, has some of the world's largest oil reserves. And the US at the time was the largest importer of that oil and buyer of that oil. And part of this North American oil boom was a way to wean the United States and the Canadian economies off of Venezuelan oil, and to also choke out Venezuela economically, and to implement sanctions more recently against the oil companies here. And so as a result, where are they going to get that oil? They're going to get it from indigenous lands, and they're going to begin by building pipelines on our lands. So in that sense, our struggles in Venezuela and in indigenous communities and in North America are connected in that way, because the US is trying to assert what Trump has called energy dominance, and they're going to unleash the American energy economy on the world. And to do that, they need indigenous lands.
So, do you believe indigenous communities together from Venezuela, United States can work together to get back to Trump with these sanctions?
Absolutely, and there's a recent history of alliance with indigenous people in North America and Venezuela. In 2007, Vernon Belcourt, who was a founder of the American Indian Movement, which was a Red Power movement in the 60s and the 70s, actually met with President Chavez and helped negotiate heating assistance for our reservations, because heating oil in the wintertime where we live is very expensive. And that went a long way. It let us know that Venezuela is not an enemy, but an ally and a friend, and that we should be working towards peaceful relations with other people of the world.
Talking about that, late President Hugo Chavez, through Citgo, subsidized millions of gallons of heating oil and assistance. I know this has a special meaning to you. What about it?
So my family, we're from the Lower Brill Reservation, and we're part of several Sioux tribes that benefited directly from this heating assistance that was provided to Northern Plains indigenous communities. And if you know anything that's happened in the United States recently, Trump shut down the federal government for 35 days to force the construction of his border wall. And this was in the middle of winter. And most of our jobs as indigenous people come from federal employment. And so what happened is that we had to choose between heat and food. And so having this assistance in the middle of winter back, it doesn't happen anymore because of sanctions, but having this assistance in the middle of winter meant so much to our communities, and that many of our people still have that memory of Chavez, and they still have that feeling of sincere solidarity and generosity.
Okay, staying in Latin America, do you believe these sanctions also affect indigenous communities in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro?
They do, because if you've been paying attention to the news, the United States is trying to begin privatizing parts of the Amazon for resource development in collaboration with Jair Bolsonaro's government. And the reasons that they're using are really nefarious. They're saying to protect the Amazon, we need to privatize it. And to privatize it, we need these corporations to come in here to invest resources to protect not only the natural resources and the forests, but to protect indigenous people. And if we've been paying attention to what's happening in the news lately, that is simply not the case.
That's true. So any last words for any indigenous communities in the world?
I just want to say that this is a global struggle, and indigenous communities are the tip of the spear. We are the most criminalized and most marginalized within our societies, but together with other struggles and other movements, that we can be the change that's necessary to get us out of this mess. We can be the change that is necessary to turn back the forces of destruction.
Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today here in From Caracas. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Like this, we've come to the end of this episode of From Caracas. I'm Laila Segabi. Until next time.